28,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, Zoe Reynolds knew two things with absolute certainty. The man 4 rows ahead was dying, and everyone was looking at the wrong person for help. "He can't breathe. Someone help him, please." The desperate cry cut through the cabin's hum. A dark-skinned woman hovered over an elegant man whose ashen face and bluish lips betrayed his distress. "I'm a hedge fund manager, not a doctor," the businesswoman shouted at a flight attendant fumbling with an emergency kit. "There must be a medical professional on this flight." Zoe watched, her 17-year-old frame tense with indecision. The cabin crew was asking for a doctor, scanning first class with desperate eyes that skipped right over her row in economy. She knew why. Who would expect a black teenager in worn jeans to have any answers? But Zoe knew exactly what was happening. She'd seen it before. What happened next would forever alter their lives, especially the billionaire, who would later confess she'd been prepared to offer anything to save her husband. What she wasn't prepared for was what the girl would eventually ask for, a request so unexpected it would bring her to her knees in tears. Victoria Blackwood stepped from her Tesla onto the pavement outside Sydney International Airport's private terminal. At 52, she carried herself with the confidence of a woman who had built an empire, a woman who expected doors to open when she approached. Today, all her wealth felt hollow as she guided her husband, Thomas, from the car. "Easy now, darling," she murmured protectively. At 45, Thomas was still striking, though recent health issues had given him a vulnerability that softened his features. "I'm fine," he insisted, hand resting over his chest. "Dr. Winters said it's just stress, induced arrhythmia. The conference in Tokyo is important." Neither noticed the public bus that pulled up at the main terminal, or the lanky teenage girl who stepped out, shouldering a battered backpack and counting loose bills. Zoe Reynolds winced as she handed over nearly all her remaining cash to the bus driver. The trip from her grandfather's apartment had cost more than anticipated. She tucked the remaining $15 into her worn wallet, emergency money her grandfather had insisted she take. "You're going to knock their socks off, kiddo," he had told her that morning, his weathered hands straightening her collar with trembling fingers. At 75, Harold Reynolds was still the strongest person Zoe knew, despite the oxygen tube that accompanied him everywhere. What she hadn't told her grandfather was that the Young Medical Achievers International program had only provided a partial scholarship. The remainder had come from years of saved birthday money, part-time jobs, and her father's small life insurance policy. This trip represented everything: her future, her dreams, her chance to eventually lift her grandfather out of their one-bedroom apartment with the unreliable heating. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Victoria scrolled through emails while Thomas leafed through a magazine. The soft leather seats created a cocoon of privilege, separating them from the main cabin. "Chest feels tight again," Thomas murmured, pressing a hand to his side. Victoria looked up immediately. "Should we call Dr. Winters?" Thomas smiled reassuringly. "It's perfectly normal. My body is just adjusting to the new medication." Meanwhile, in economy class, Zoe reviewed medical terminology on flashcards. "Cardiac tamponade," she whispered. "Symptoms include chest pain, difficulty breathing, rapid heart rate." She flipped to the next card, unaware that this particular condition would become horrifyingly relevant soon. 3 hours into the flight, Thomas's discomfort worsened. Victoria pressed the call button as his breathing became labored. Nancy, the flight attendant, appeared quickly. "Mr. Blackwood, are you feeling all right?" "I'm fine, just." Thomas paused, a sharper pain interrupting his words. His hand flew to his chest. "Actually, I'm having trouble catching my breath." Nancy checked his pulse with practiced efficiency. "I'm going to get our first aid kit and see if there's a doctor on board," she said, though her quickened pace betrayed her concern. Thomas's condition deteriorated rapidly. His breathing became more labored, sweat breaking out across his forehead. "Victoria," he gasped, genuine fear in his eyes. "Something's wrong. My heart." Victoria clutched his hand, her composed exterior crumbling. "Help?" she called out. "My husband needs help." The commotion rippled through the plane. Zoe heard snippets of worried conversation. Man in first class, breathing problems, possible heart attack. "Is there a doctor on board?" a flight attendant called, scanning the economy cabin after finding no medical personnel in business or first class. Zoe recognized the symptoms being described: shortness of breath, chest pain, sweating. Her grandfather had experienced similar symptoms during a frightening episode the previous year. The diagnosis had been cardiac tamponade. She hesitated, doubt holding her back. Who would listen to a teenager? But the continued calls for help propelled her to action. Standing up, Zoe raised her hand. "I'm not a doctor, but I might know what's happening." The flight attendant barely glanced her way. "We need a medical professional. Please stay seated." "It could be cardiac tamponade," Zoe persisted, louder. "Is he on blood thinners? Has he had recent heart surgery?" This time, the flight attendant paused, registering both her words and her youth with surprise. "How do you?" "My grandfather had it last year. If it is tamponade, he needs to be upright, not flat, and oxygen immediately. Do you have aspirin?" For a moment, the flight attendant seemed torn between protocol and the confident authority in Zoe's voice. Then, a more urgent call from the front made the decision for her. "Come with me." The scene in first class was chaos contained within luxury. Thomas lay reclined, his complexion ashen, his breathing shallow and rapid. Victoria hovered beside him, her face a mask of helpless terror. Victoria looked up as Zoe approached, confusion and desperation warring in her expression. "Who's this? Where's the doctor?" "There's no doctor on board," the flight attendant explained. "This young woman says she might know what's happening." Victoria's eyes narrowed, taking in Zoe's youth, her casual clothes, making calculations and judgments as she'd been conditioned to do. Under normal circumstances, she wouldn't have entrusted this girl with getting her coffee order right, let alone her husband's life. But these were not normal circumstances. "What's wrong with my husband?" she demanded. Zoe swallowed. "Ma'am, I think he might have cardiac tamponade, fluid building up around his heart. The symptoms match, and if he's on blood thinners or had recent heart surgery, that increases the risk." "And you know this how exactly?" Victoria's voice was taut with suspicion. "I take care of my grandfather. He has similar heart issues. I've been studying medicine since I was 12. Zoe moved closer to Thomas. "Sir, have you had any recent heart procedures, or are you taking anticoagulants?" Thomas nodded weakly. "Pericardiocentesis, 3 weeks ago, on warfarin." Zoe's suspicions were confirmed. "We need to get him more upright, not reclined," she told the flight attendant. "Oxygen, and aspirin, if you have it." Victoria watched in stunned silence as the teenager gently helped reposition her husband, explaining each move with a calm confidence that seemed incongruous with her youth. "The fluid is probably building up again after your procedure," Zoe explained to Thomas. "The upright position will take some pressure off your heart and lungs." "How do you know all this?" Victoria asked again, the accusatory edge replaced by something closer to wonder. Zoe finally looked up, meeting the older woman's gaze directly. "Because I had to know. My grandfather, he depends on me." The captain announced they would be making an emergency landing in Honolulu. Throughout the tense hour that followed, Zoe remained by Thomas's side, monitoring his vital signs and providing clear updates. "My grandfather always says panic uses oxygen we can't spare," she told him with a gentle smile, "so we're going to stay calm together." Victoria, watching this interaction, struggled with complex emotions. Relief battled with the uncomfortable realization that she had immediately discounted this young woman based solely on appearance. "What's your name?" Victoria asked finally. "Zoe. Zoe Reynolds, ma'am." "Thank you, Zoe," Victoria said, the words inadequate for the weight she tried to convey. "Don't thank me yet," Zoe interrupted gently. "He needs proper medical care as soon as possible." She hesitated, then added, "I was supposed to be interviewing at the Young Medical Achievers program in Tokyo tomorrow. Guess that's not happening now." The fluorescent lights of Queen's Medical Center cast a harsh glow over the waiting room, erasing the distinctions of class and privilege that had separated Victoria from Zoe just hours before. Thomas had been rushed into emergency care, a team of doctors confirming Zoe's diagnosis of cardiac tamponade. The medical staff had been impressed by the quick intervention on the plane. "The next 24 hours will be critical," the doctor had explained. "We're draining the fluid from around his heart now." In the sterile limbo of the waiting room, Victoria found herself studying the young woman who sat several chairs away. In the harsh hospital lighting, Zoe looked even younger than she had on the plane. "You should get some rest," Victoria said, breaking the silence. "There's nothing more to be done tonight." Zoe looked up, shadows under her eyes. "I'd like to know he's going to be all right." Victoria nodded, a lump forming unexpectedly in her throat. This girl had no obligation to Thomas, yet here she sat at 2 in the morning in a foreign city, having missed the opportunity she'd traveled so far to pursue. "Tell me about this program," Victoria said. "The one in Tokyo." Zoe straightened slightly. "Young Medical Achievers. It's for high school students planning medical careers. Only 50 students worldwide get accepted each year." Her voice took on a quiet pride. "The program offers full scholarships to college for the top 10 participants." "And you're missing it because of us," Victoria stated flatly. Zoe shrugged, but the disappointment was evident. "Some things matter more. My grandfather would say the same." "You mentioned caring for your grandfather," Victoria prompted after a moment. "He has heart failure, COPD, and arthritis that's getting worse." Zoe replied matter-of-factly, "Been taking care of him since my dad passed 3 years ago, just the two of us now." Victoria absorbed this information, mentally reconstructing her understanding of the young woman before her. Not a girl, really, despite her youth. Someone who had shouldered adult responsibilities far earlier than most. "And the medical knowledge?" Victoria asked. "That's from caring for him. Had to learn fast. Our neighborhood doesn't have the best access to healthcare. When Dad got sick, I started reading everything I could find. Grandpa says I've got a gift for it." A faint smile crossed her face. "He works too hard to make sure I can keep studying. Takes in mending, even with his arthritis. That's why this program mattered so much." The matter-of-fact recitation of hardship, delivered without self-pity, struck Victoria forcefully. "I've been unfair to you," Victoria admitted abruptly. "On the plane, I saw." She stopped, uncomfortable with naming her own prejudice. "I know what you saw, ma'am," Zoe said quietly without accusation. "I'm used to it." A doctor appeared at the waiting room entrance. "Mrs. Blackwood? Your husband is asking for you. He's also asking for Zoe." Thomas had been moved to a private room, multiple monitors tracking his vital signs. He looked pale against the white hospital sheets, but his breathing was clearly easier. His eyes brightened as the two entered. "My heroes," he said, his voice weak but warm. "They told me what you did, Zoe, that you recognized what was happening when no one else could." Zoe ducked her head, suddenly shy. "Anyone with the same knowledge would have done the same, sir." "But no one else had that knowledge," he insisted. "The doctor said without the quick intervention on the plane, I might not have made it." Victoria moved to his other side, bending to kiss his forehead. "How are you feeling, darling?" Better. They say the fluid is draining well. He squeezed Zoe's hand. Victoria told me you missed your interview for a medical program because of our emergency. Zoe shifted uncomfortably. It's not important right now. It is important, Thomas insisted. Victoria says it could have meant a scholarship, your future. There will be other opportunities, Zoe said, though the slight tightening of her jaw suggested she didn't entirely believe it. As Zoe stepped out to call her grandfather, Victoria lingered by Thomas's bedside, an unfamiliar turmoil of thoughts churning within her. In the span of a few hours, her carefully ordered worldview had been disrupted by this chance encounter with a young woman who defied every unconscious assumption she'd made. The next morning, Victoria found Zoe in the hotel cafe, bent over a cup of coffee and a notebook. Mrs. Blackwood, how is Mr. Blackwood this morning? Much better, thanks to you. Victoria said, sitting across from Zoe. I want to help you. Not as payment, but as recognition of who you are, what you're capable of, the kind of doctor you could become. For the first time, Zoe's careful composure showed a crack, a flicker of hope quickly suppressed. That's very generous, Mrs. Blackwood, but… Let me finish. Victoria said, I have connections at several medical schools, financial resources that could ensure you get the education you deserve. Consider it an investment in a future physician. She watched as Zoe absorbed this offer, conflicting emotions playing across the young woman's face. Pride warred visibly with practicality, dignity with need. Take some time to think about it, Victoria added. This isn't charity, Zoe. It's recognition of merit. Zoe was silent for a moment. My grandfather always says, opportunities come and go, but doing right isn't optional. The simple statement stirred something in Victoria, a recognition of the kind of principled character that her wealth had insulated her from encountering in recent decades. Your grandfather sounds like a wise man, Victoria said softly. Zoe hesitated, then added, but there's something else I wanted to ask you about, not for me, but for my community. Victoria's eyebrows rose slightly. What about it? In my neighborhood, there's a free clinic that serves mostly white residents. It's understaffed, underfunded, and the building is falling apart. People wait hours to see the only doctor, who's there just 3 days a week. Zoe's voice remained level, but her hands betrayed her emotion. If you really want to help, that would mean more to me than any scholarship. The request caught Victoria off guard. She had expected a request for cash, perhaps connections to the medical program. Instead, this remarkable young woman was asking not for herself, but for her community. Of course, Victoria said immediately. I can arrange for funding, equipment, whatever they need. Zoe shook her head slowly. It's not just about money or equipment, Mrs. Blackwood. It's about how the system works or doesn't work for communities like mine. The clinic needs sustainable support, not just a one-time donation that makes the donor feel good. Victoria listened as Zoe spoke with quiet passion about the healthcare disparities in her community. As Zoe spoke, Victoria felt something shift inside her. The humanitarian award waiting in Tokyo suddenly seemed hollow, a recognition of tax-deductible donations rather than meaningful change. 6 months later, the Reynolds Community Health Center opened its doors in a renovated building. On the dedication plaque, a simple quotation appeared, "Doing right isn't optional. Harold Reynolds." Inside, community residents found not just medical care but dignity, doctors who looked like them, staff who spoke their languages, systems designed to accommodate rather than exclude them. In one corner office, Zoe Reynolds spent her after-school hours coordinating between medical staff and community needs, her natural leadership abilities flourishing under mentorship that recognized her unique perspective as an asset. In a private hospital room across town, Victoria sat beside Thomas, who was recovering from his latest procedure. On the table between them sat a tablet displaying a video call with Harold Reynolds, whose health had improved dramatically under the care of specialists Victoria had arranged. "That granddaughter of yours is something special," Victoria told the elderly man. "She's transformed how we approach our entire foundation's work." Harold beamed with pride. "Told you she had a gift, not just for medicine, but for seeing what needs fixing and having the courage to say so." As they ended the call, Thomas reached for Victoria's hand. Who would have thought a medical emergency at 28,000 feet would lead to all this? Victoria nodded, watching through the window as Zoe arrived in the parking lot below, her grandfather carefully making his way from the Foundation-provided accessible van. "What she asked for," Victoria said quietly, "it wasn't just funding for a clinic, it was recognition of her community's worth, of the dignity every person deserves in their most vulnerable moments." Her voice thickened unexpectedly. "All things I would have missed completely if crisis hadn't forced me to see." Thomas squeezed her hand. Sometimes the most valuable investments aren't the ones that show up on balance sheets. What Zoe had asked for in return for her heroism wasn't anything Victoria had expected. Not money, not connections, not personal advantage, but recognition of a shared humanity that wealth and privilege had blinded her to for too long. It was a request that had indeed brought Victoria to tears, tears of shame, of gratitude, and ultimately of hope for the more connected world they were now building together.